The next thing we're going to talk about is one of my favorite things because it's just that important, and that's segmenting your audience. If you serve more than one audience, which I think we all do, different segments of our audiences have different problems. For example, a distributor might be selling to two types of companies or two companies that are in different sectors, like a lighting distributor who sells lighting to hospitals and universities, but he also sells lighting to residential contractors. Now, depending on who's making the buying decision, a salesperson knows going into a meeting with a buyer what to say to each different audience, right? He knows what to say to someone that's purchasing for a hospital because he knows what hospitals need. And he would have an entirely different conversation with a residential contractor. The problem, though, is that if you can't get your salesperson in front of those buyers, it's actually up to your digital content to convey those same messages to those two very different audiences. In other words, we want to get the information to the buyer for the hospital that applies to the hospital's issues. And we want to get the information to the residential contractor that applies to his issues. And of course, this begins with segmenting your audiences. But it's more than that. Okay, thinking about segmenting your audiences, it's not a hard thing to do. We know who they are. Contractors, large commercial, small residential, large residential. But remember, it's not about knowing who they are or what hat they're wearing. It's knowing what their problems are. Because we know that people search on solutions to their problems. So your goal in attracting these audiences is to build content, right? And we're talking about content because remember, we can't have our salespeople always speaking to these customers. So we have to have content out on the internet that addresses each individual audience's problems. In order to do that, we have to first, of course, identify who they are, but we have to also know what their problems are, what their hot buttons are. So we take them through a process called the buyer persona creation process. A buyer persona is just another name for what some people call customer avatar or your ideal customer profile. It's a very difficult process because everything that goes into the buyer persona process has to come out of a salesperson's head. There's just no way around it because they know the customer inside and out. But what the problem is, a lot of us take for granted what we have inside our heads. We think that what's clear to us is clear to everyone else, but it's not. So there's a lot of teasing out information. You're asking the same question a few different ways to really get to the crux of what these audience segments' problems are. All right, when you go through this process, you're going to start with some demographic info, which is pretty easy. But then you have to identify their goals, their problems, their pain points, their challenges. Then the next step is to identify what your company can do to help solve their problems or their challenges or help them attain the goal. Now, obviously, a marketing person can't do this on their own because they don't know what all the customers' pain points are. So they have to do this side by side with a salesperson. Oh, and then also anyone that's client-facing should also participate in this process. Now, let me show you a little bit of what this looks like. So this is a piece of a buyer persona worksheet. It's not usually side by side like this, but I did it this way so that you can see the difference. And so you'll see in the left column, we have a small electrical contractor who is a residential contractor and a large electrical contractor who is a commercial contractor. And when we first are doing these buyer personas, the key word is buyer. Who's making the buying decision? So right away, when it's a small electrical contractor, you know the buying decision is being made by the owner of the company. That's what he does. It's his business. But in a large commercial contractor, it's usually the VP of purchasing. It's not the owner of the company. So totally different goals. If you look through these goals, I'm just going to touch on a few. The small electrical contractor is interested in building a successful business to provide for his family and his employees, to eventually sell his business, to stay up to date with code and new technologies. Where the large contractor, the VP of purchasing, he is worried about totally different things. He's got to worry about his managers. He's got to worry about staying within time constraints and bid constraints and showing a profit. He's got to find all sorts of cutting edge type of products that come in at reasonable prices. And he has to worry about keeping his job, right? He has to worry about doing all this stuff really well. So big differences there. Now, let's take a look at the challenges of the same audiences. You'll see some of the challenges are the same. Keeping up with technology is in both columns. Time management is in both columns. But meanwhile, the small electrical contractor, he's looking for good employees for his business. The large contractor is worried about keeping guys moving on a job site where it's, a huge job site, and he's juggling a lot of things. He has to worry about having product on the site at the right time and not, making a mess on the site. Even though they have some of the same things in their columns, like keeping up with technology, when you really think about it, the technology the small electrical contractor is going to use is going to be very different technology than the large electrical contractor's purchasing agent is using, because they have different problems. They have different problems to solve. When you come at your customer base with content to help them solve problems, you have to make it about the problem, not about your product. Your audiences won't always make that connection in their mind between their problem and your product. If you're a salesperson sitting in front of them, you can make that connection for them. But if you're not and you're doing it online, you have to kind of build, almost like breadcrumbs, lead them to the solution by targeting their problems. It starts with the buyer persona and getting all of this out on paper. But the good news is that once it's on paper and you give it to a marketing person, they know exactly what to create. Now, you might be wondering, where do you start? We have 8 different customer bases. How can we do all of them? Because you really only want to do one at a time. And it's going to be up to your company. You can start with the one that's most profitable. You can start with the one that generates the most cash flow. You can start with the one that you think you'll get done with faster so you can get the ball rolling. It's going to depend, on what your priorities are.
Hey, it's Susan Merlo. If you like that video and want to learn more, call or text me. I'd love to hear about your business and show you how this would work for your sales team.